Hello everyone, welcome to this week's Maker Exchange activity. My name is Mr. Martin, and today I'll be walking you through learning Tinkercad, a very powerful and browser-based online 3D design software. So, as we begin this tutorial, you'll notice that we have the info pane over here on the left. We have our title bar up top. We have a command bar with currently grayed out commands, we'll get to those later. We have our workspace right in the middle. And then we have our object pane over here on the right hand side. Our first step is fairly simple. We'll head over to the info pane and hit next, which will give us a set of instructions. You can click show hint to go into more detail, and a scroll bar will pop up when there is more information to be read. All we have to do is click on this light brown tower with our left mouse button, hold down that button, and drag the tower over to the outline. Try and get it as close as possible. Once you do that, go ahead and hit next. You'll see confetti pop up, and you're ready to move on to the next lesson. This next step is all about learning the camera controls. Within our workspace, we can change the viewing angle to get a better look at what we're trying to do. When you hit next, it'll instruct you to mess around with the view cube. That's on the top left of the workspace. You can double click on the edges or the corners to quickly jump to that viewing angle. You can even click and drag to get a full 360-degree view. Hit next and we'll start playing around with the zoom feature. You can use your mouse scroll wheel or touchpad to zoom in or out. The middle mouse button lets you move your entire workspace, and the right mouse button lets you swivel the camera for a quick 360-degree view. We'll learn to combine all three of these features in order to get the view that we're looking for. And if you're wondering what the left mouse button does, it actually lets us select items, which we'll put to use later. For now, continue to play around with the camera controls. Try and get a specific viewing angle centered on your screen. One thing to keep in mind is to try not to mix up the left and right mouse buttons. Remember that one does click and drag objects and the other clicks and drags the camera. So try not to get those mixed up. You can always undo any unwanted mistakes. Next up, we're going to finally put to use that object pane on the right hand side. It comes preloaded for us into the basic shapes option, which we're going to use to insert a polygon into the preloaded wrench. So scroll down on that window, click on the polygon or click and drag, and insert it onto the outline you see on the screen. When we do that, a shape window will pop up. This gives us some basic info about that object we just inserted and any others that we may have selected. You can click the arrow to hide that option away, but we're going to need that in a second. So if you scroll down to the info pane, it wants us to use the hole tool to actually create a hole in the wrench. So in that shape window, apart from a color, it gives us the hole option. When we click that, that's telling the program that we actually want to remove that volume from the current objects. And it's smart enough to know where and when those two objects interact. So we're going to click next. And then from here, you're actually going to go to the group option. So you want to select both the wrench and your polygon. You'll notice a little 2 comes up in the shape window. And then hit group. And when we do that, it'll actually cut out that space in the wrench. Hitting next completes that part of the tutorial. But before we move on, I do want to point out that there are many basic shapes preloaded that we can work with. So you can actually create holes or create objects of varying complexity just using the preloaded shapes in the program. This next step in the tutorial starts us with the blank work plane. We're going to learn to manipulate individual objects. So in order to do that, we need to first insert the cylinder. So in the object pane, click and drag or click once to insert. You'll notice the shape window comes up yet again, and we get these little dots on our object. We're actually going to use those to do what we're trying to do here. So insert a second cylinder. That first one's going to serve as a baseline for us. Once you've inserted that second cylinder, you can then click or drag on those little dots on the object in order to manipulate the dimensions. I always prefer clicking and then manipulating the number. You can always click and drag and it'll show you the changes as you're making them in real time. But it wants us to change the cylinder to be 15 millimeters tall. So I'm going to click on the top dot go to where the number is shown and just type 15.00. And you'll notice it automatically snaps down. Now, again, you can click and drag to change it, but you'll notice now we have one short cylinder and one tall cylinder. To copy paste with the cylinder on the left selected, using the keyboard, simply hit Control C and then Control V, and you'll be able to copy that cylinder. Once we do that, it wants to move it over to the outline shown, and that's the thing, it won't always paste where you want it to go, but you can always click and drag. Again, just make sure that you only have selected the object you want to manipulate. And so here it's a little tricky to get that cylinder out from the middle, but we do so, and we're able to move it over to the side. Now go ahead and make it match that outline and hit next. One thing to note is that it will show you the dimension based on your camera angle or what you currently have selected, so just keep that in mind when you're changing them, if you're like me and prefer to type them in. So for this last step, we're going to simply shorten the cylinder down to 10 millimeters, and once we do that, we've completed this step. Before we move on, I just wanted to show that we do have to keep in mind what objects we have selected. When you're moving or copying, pasting, whatever it may be, you want to make sure that it's only on the object you're actually trying to manipulate. If you select several objects, you can move them at once. You can group different things to move them together. But just again, be aware of that. And then if you do mess up, you can hit Control Z to simply undo. Now we're getting into the real nitty-gritty of what Tinkercad can do. In the work plane, you'll see the letters of the alphabet come preloaded, as well as a big bar object. We're actually going to use this to make a keychain. So when we hit next, the outline for the word Katie comes up. You can choose whatever name you'd like, but for simplicity's sake, we're just going to follow along with that and pretend that our name is Katie. So when selecting objects, remember what we just learned. You can move multiple by selecting multiple. And to do that, you would just hit Shift and click on several letters, or you can do one thing at a time. Before we do that though, we want to change the snap grid setting. And what that's going to let us do is get more specific as to where our objects are being placed. On the bottom right hand side of the work plane, you'll notice the snap grid option. Let's just change that to 0.25 millimeters so that we can actually get very, very close to the sides of the object that already exists. Not only that, it'll help us line up our letters in an easier fashion so that there's less mistakes overall, and it just looks a little cleaner. So go ahead and grab that letter K or click on it and drag it over and place it within the outline of the first letter. Remember, you can change the camera angle to get it better situated within the outline. And the last thing is you can actually use your keyboard keys, the arrows, to nudge the object one direction or the other. And it is based on your current camera angle. So if you press up or down, depending on what side you're looking at, it's going to move it up or down relative to what you are currently facing. So with that in mind, just make sure you place the letter properly within the outline, or if you were working on your own object, that would help you get very, very close to where you wanted things to be. Next up, grab the letter A, place it in there. Once again, use the keyboard keys to nudge it if necessary. And one thing I do want to mention is don't pay attention too much here in the tutorial regarding the color. That's just there to help us denote different objects. Later on when we're creating our own objects, the color will simply be there, again, to help us figure out individual objects. When we group them, as you'll see in a moment, they'll all change to the same color to denote that they are in fact the same object. So finally, once we have all of our letters in, you'll notice that it spells out the word Katie, and we're ready to move on to the next step. But before we do that, go ahead and take a quick look around, make sure everything is lined up properly. Once you hit next to move on to the next step, it's going to show you that the base is too long. And so we want to actually select that base and shrink it down. Now for this one, unlike the previous step in the tutorial, it doesn't give us a specific length or number. So instead of typing it in, we're just going to click the black dot and drag it over until it matches the outline that it gives us. Now you'll notice for some reason it did load two of them here. If for whatever reason yours doesn't load, you can always hit reset on the bottom. But for this instance, we're just going to click both of them over and drag them to the same size. Once we group them, it's not going to matter, and I'll go over why at the end of this step. But you want to shorten it to match the name that you put in, and in this case, we have the name Katie. So our keychain is done, but we have all these other objects in our workspace that we no longer need. So using the left mouse button, you can click and drag to select multiple items, and it'll show you the exact number up in the Shapes window. But we want to click on the top view of the view cube to make it easier to click and drag all of the letters. And so here, we're going to delete them all by pressing the delete key once they're selected. And poof, they disappear, and we're left with just the object that we want, which is our keychain. Now, you can hit next to move on to the next step. You go ahead and zoom in just to make sure you have a better view of it. But grouping is what we're going to do now. And this is important because it's going to combine all of our individual objects into one. As opposed to the whole, we're going to select the solid option here. And notice it just chooses a color based on one of the objects that's selected. But once we group it all together, it becomes one entire complete object, which is very important when we go to print this in our 3D printer. The 3D printing software will slice it and create layers, and when you have it as one entire object, it reduces the chance of any errors happening in between those objects. So you always want to try and group it before printing. Now we have arrived at the final part of the tutorial, which is all about manipulating the work plane. Now the work plane is very nice because it's what we use to snap other objects to. But it turns out you can actually change where they snap to by changing the work plane. And so here we have a preloaded die, but it's missing some numbers and letters. And we're going to learn how to adjust one side at a time by manipulating the work plane. Hit next and you'll notice that a new kind of outline shows up on the object. And that's basically telling us where to plant the new work plane. And to edit the work plane, we're going to go over to the top right above the object plane. You'll notice that this cool little tool comes up and it automatically sticks to the surface of our object. And we want to put it right on the face of the die that we're currently working with. And the work plane will change to orange to denote that you are editing basically on a custom work plane. And it'll show you where that axis lies so that you know which face of the object you're currently working on. The original work plane will still show up in blue. So now under the Basic Shapes tab, we're going to change that to say Text and Numbers and view other preloaded objects. And under here in the second page, we'll find the number 5. So same as with the polygons that we've included before, simply click on it or drag it into the outline, and you'll notice it'll snap into place and appear. But it's a little too thick, and so we want to make sure that it shrinks down to fit on the proper dimensions that we want. So go ahead and click on it. Same as the cylinder object, you can either click and drag or change it to the specific number. And here it tells us to shrink it down so that it fits. And we want it to be 1 millimeter thick to match the rest of the numbers. And now that we've done that, we still need to edit the number 6. So go ahead and change the work plane once again. Notice how throughout this entire process, I'm constantly changing the camera, zooming in or zooming out. Once you get more practice, it'll become a bit more natural to you. And so same with the number 5. We're just going to snap the number 6 onto there. And once again, we're going to shrink it down to be 1 millimeter thick. Not 6 millimeters. Oops. We just want 1 millimeter. That's me getting ahead of myself there. And now we want to drag the work plane back to the original location. So to do that, we're going to zoom out a little. We're going to once again click on the work plane tool. And remember that blue outline that stayed? We're just going to simply click anywhere outside of our object, and we're back to normal. To finish up our object, we just want to make sure that we have everything selected and grouped. So you can click and drag to select everything in view. and make sure you hit the group option in the top right. Once again, what that's going to do is combine everything into one solid object so that now we're free to print or manipulate it however we'd like. That completes the tutorial portion, but there is still much to go over. If you go back to the project page, you'll see individual basic lessons that go over different skills. And you can even click the logo on the top left to go to your profile and view what projects you've been working on. You'll notice here I cleared my profile page so that we can easily just create a new design. And what we're going to do is make a personalized keychain that's a little more complex than the one we made in the tutorial. So you see everything you saw in the tutorial minus the info pane. So let's go ahead and insert a box and put it right in the middle of our work plane. Change the snap grid to 0.25 millimeters to make it easier to work with. And now we're going to shrink down our base layer to about 4 millimeters. Once that's adjusted, go ahead and click on the dot to adjust the horizontal edge. Pull it out to about 60 millimeters. That's going to give us plenty of space to work with for now. You can always adjust this later if you need to. And you'll notice here we have our object pane still. Like I mentioned, the info pane is gone. And up top, we can go ahead and quickly change the title of our project to personalized keychain. Now, on the right hand side in the object pane, let's click on the torus or the little donut shape and go ahead and insert it where it's overlapping our base. You can use the keyboard to adjust to make sure it's centered. Again, here I'm using the camera angle to make sure that it is centered by clicking, making sure I'm on the top view. But you'll notice here that the objects overlap, and we want to adjust the height so that they're both about the same thickness. And for now, this will make up the base of our keychain. Go ahead and move in the torus a little bit just to make it more realistic and sturdy. You can still see part of the torus within our base object, and that basically tells us that it is an individual object, and there's a potential for some printing problems down the line. So what we're going to do is select both objects here, and we're going to group them together to make sure that they are indeed one object. So now whenever we're manipulating our base as a whole, it is one solid object and not an individual torus and a box. So under the basic shapes category, you can actually click on text and numbers. And the cool part about it is you can select text and now input custom text onto your object. And so here I'm going to just type in my name, press enter, or click outside of the shape window. We're going to adjust the height a little bit just so that it's not too thick. Again, we're going to start with the 4 millimeter base just to be safe. But you'll notice that this is still a little too thick and our object or text is within our object. And so we can actually pull it out using this little cone that comes up when we select our text. That just lets us elevate based on our current work plane. We're going to lift it up a few millimeters and make sure that it actually fits onto our base. And we're going to use this function to then make a keychain with our name embedded as opposed to material layered on top. When adjusting the size of an object, you can hold shift to maintain the aspect ratio as opposed to having to edit one side at a time. So once we've got it properly fitted on there and it's elevated to the point where we have part of our text material overlapping with the object material, in the shape window we can select whole and then group those two objects to then create a cutout of our name onto our keychain. Here is where you once again have to think about the limitations of your printer. Just make sure that the text isn't too deep or too shallow, and you give enough thickness for the text layers so that your printer can actually print them with good enough definition. Otherwise, you could end up with a jumbled mess up top, or letters so deep that the actual base material loses its structural integrity. So once you have it properly lined up, you can go ahead and group those to create the cutout of the text. Just make sure you select everything in sight and then group it. And so now you'll notice the part of the torus that was inside of our base object has also been cut out. And that's the reason why we wanted to group those first. If you hadn't grouped those, you would actually still see part of the torus sticking out from that text portion. If for whatever reason you found that you were unhappy with how it came out or your thicknesses look a little messed up, well, you can always select everything and ungroup it. Tinkercad does preserve each shape as its individual object, so you can always manipulate it and keep trying until you get it just right. For our purposes though, we're going to keep it as one solid object, and let's say hypothetically you wanted to add this to the zipper on a backpack. Well, we can insert a wedge over here in the basic shapes tool, and that's going to let us create a little opening in the key loop so where it can snap into or onto any other loop, in this case the zipper portion. First, we do want to adjust the wedge to match the shape that we want to cut out, and to do so we're going to use the rotate tool. So this is new to us. Anytime you click on an object, you'll notice that these little arrows come up on the axes. You can either click those to type in the exact angle, or just click and drag to rotate to the angle you'd like along that axis. And so play around with it until you figure out the axis that you want. Here we're going to rotate it 90 degrees to the side, and then we're going to shrink the dimensions so that's a little more manageable. However, vertically, we don't want it to be 4 millimeters. We do want to shrink it down just a little bit. We want it to be larger than the material that we're going to be cutting out. And so if our material here is 4 millimeters thick, I'm just going to go ahead and quickly change this to 5 millimeters to make sure that when I do create the hole, it's not leaving any material behind. And you'll see why in a second. So now we'll move it into place. And here you'll just see me tinker with the shape of the wedge to get it just right and to make sure it's looking like what I want it to look like. And we can do this because the materials that we commonly print with, either TPA or PLA, are fairly rigid but flexible plastics. So it does have some bend and give in it if we wanted to snap this onto a different object. Once I am satisfied with the shape, I'm going to create the hole by clicking on the hole tool up in the shapes window, selecting everything and grouping it together, and bum bum bum, you'll notice that there is some material left over. Now, even though I adjusted the vertical height, I did not offset the wedge to the bottom of the material, and so everything snapped to the work plane. And you'll notice that a tiny sliver of material overlapped between the two objects, and that material did not get cut out. And so that's just a limitation of the software we're using here, but it's easily overridden. Simply drop down the wedge just a little bit to make sure that you're cutting out the complete shape of the wedge. So select everything again, group it once more, as long as the wedge is the hole, and you should have your nice little snappable key loop now. So I can take this time to clean up the key loop. I can smooth off that pointed edge. I can insert another object to trim off the excess material. But let's say I wanted to edit the other side of this as well and put my name on that. So I can select everything and ungroup it. And what this lets me do is then select just the text that I've already put in and copy that. And it'll copy it as its own individual object. So I'm hitting Control C on my keyboard right now. And once I've made sure that it's copied, I can go ahead and either redo or just select everything and group it all again, and then rotate it as one solid object. So there we have our keychain we made. Let's go ahead and rotate it 180 degrees. And now I have the backside to work with. And simply pressing Control V on the keyboard will paste in my text as its own individual object again. And the same thing we did with the first one. We just want to lift it up off the work plane to where it's not completely within our material. And here's another dangerous trick or part to it. If you're cutting out, let's say 2 millimeters on each side of a 4 millimeter thick object, you're going to end up with no material in between. So you want to make sure that when you offset these texts, that you've left some kind of space in between. Otherwise, you're essentially going to create a mirrored hole all the way through the object, and your keychain will look a little weird. So here I'm lifting it up just enough to where it's not completely passing through to the other side. And that ensures that when I do eventually create this new hole, the text cutout is not going all the way through. And so you see there, we've completed our keychain, and there's material in between our two text layers on both sides. And now we're ready to print. So folks, that does it for this basic Tinkercad tutorial. If you enjoyed this content, be sure to give our other Maker Exchange videos a try. We'll see you in the next one.